No one wakes up one day and decides to stop desiring the person they love. It doesn't happen suddenly. It happens quietly, between unanswered touches, between nights where bodies lie close, but worlds feel far apart. The absence of sex is rarely just about sex. It is about what stopped being said, what stopped being felt, and what slowly stopped being alive between two people who once couldn't keep their hands off each other. The silence that begins in the body and spreads through the relationship. At first, it doesn't feel dramatic. There is no argument, no betrayal, no clear breaking point. There is just a moment when one person reaches out and the other doesn't respond. A moment when a kiss becomes shorter, when touch becomes functional instead of curious, when desire is postponed, then postponed again, until it quietly disappears from the calendar of the relationship. Most couples don't talk about this stage. They normalize it. They tell themselves it's stress, work, exhaustion, children, routine, time, and all of that may be true. But what they don't realize is that something much deeper has already begun to shift. Because sex is not only an act, it is a language. And when that language disappears, silence enters the relationship in ways words cannot replace. The body is often the first to notice what the mind tries to rationalize. The body senses rejection before it is spoken. It feels distance before it is named. And it stores resentment long before the couple admits something is wrong. One partner starts to feel unwanted. The other starts to feel pressured. And neither feels safe enough to speak honestly about it. So the body closes. And when the body closes, desire doesn't die loudly. It fades. This is where many relationships begin their slow emotional erosion. Because desire is not sustained by love alone. It is sustained by curiosity, presence, and emotional risk. And when sex disappears, what often disappears with it is the permission to be fully seen. In long-term relationships, sex becomes one of the last places where vulnerability still lives. It is where partners show not just affection, but need. Not just connection, but longing. And when that space closes, couples lose a powerful bridge between their inner worlds. Without sex, many couples continue functioning. They manage the household, they raise children, they plan vacations, they solve problems, but they stop meeting each other emotionally. The relationship becomes efficient, but not alive. This is why the absence of sex is rarely neutral. It always means something. Sometimes it means unresolved resentment. Sometimes it means emotional exhaustion. Sometimes it means one partner no longer feels desired, and the other no longer feels free. And sometimes it means the relationship has become too safe. Safety is essential for love. But desire needs more than safety. It needs mystery. It needs space. It needs individuality. When couples fuse too much, when roles replace identities, when partners stop seeing each other as separate beings with inner worlds, desire struggles to breathe. Sex requires a small distance. Not emotional distance, but psychological space. The space to wonder, to imagine, to choose the other again. When that space collapses, sex often goes with it. And here is the part many people find uncomfortable to admit. The absence of sex doesn't only affect intimacy, it affects power. When sex disappears, the balance of desire shifts. One person often wants more, the other wants less, and suddenly, intimacy becomes a negotiation instead of an expression. The one who wants more feels rejected, ashamed, or needy. The one who wants less feels controlled, guilty, or defensive. This dynamic slowly poisons the emotional climate of the relationship, because desire cannot survive under pressure, and love cannot thrive under silence. Many couples stay in this space for years. They don't leave, they don't cheat, they don't fight loudly, they simply drift. They become companions instead of lovers, partners instead of intimates, roommates instead of chosen desires. And while companionship is valuable, it is not enough for many people's emotional needs. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is that it often feels normal. There is no crisis that forces action, no dramatic event that demands change. Just a quiet acceptance of something that is slowly eroding connection from the inside. And over time, this erosion shows up in subtle ways. In irritability over small things, in emotional withdrawal, in fantasies that stay unspoken, in a growing sense of loneliness, even while sharing the same bed. The absence of sex becomes a mirror reflecting deeper emotional truths. Not because sex is everything, but because sex reveals everything. It reveals how safe we feel, how desired we feel, how alive we feel in the presence of the other. And when that mirror goes dark, couples lose one of their clearest signals that something needs attention. This is not about frequency. It is not about performance. It is not about obligation. It is about vitality. A relationship without sexual energy often struggles to renew itself emotionally, because desire is one of the forces that pulls partners back into each other's inner worlds. Without it, distance becomes easier, silence becomes familiar, and avoidance becomes a coping strategy. This is why many people say, everything is fine, except the sex. But the truth is, when sex disappears, everything is rarely fine. The absence of sex is often the symptom, not the cause, a sign that something essential has stopped flowing between two people. And until that silence is addressed, not forced, not blamed, but understood, the relationship continues to slowly lose its emotional pulse. In the next chapter, we will explore why desire so often collapses under routine, and how the tension between safety and mystery quietly shapes the erotic life of long-term couples. Desire, routine, and the conflict between safety and mystery. Desire does not disappear because people stop loving each other. In fact, it often disappears precisely where love feels most secure. This is one of the most misunderstood realities of long-term relationships. We are taught to believe that intimacy grows naturally with closeness. That the more we know someone, the more desire should deepen. That emotional safety automatically fuels erotic connection. But desire does not follow the same rules as love. Love seeks closeness. Desire needs space. Love wants reassurance. Desire thrives on uncertainty. Love is built through repetition, reliability, and familiarity. Desire is ignited by curiosity, novelty, and imagination. And here lies the central tension of long-term relationships. As couples build a life together, they naturally prioritize safety. They create routines. They assign roles. They become predictable to one another. This is not a failure. It is a necessary foundation for stability, trust, and partnership. But over time, the very structures that protect the relationship can begin to suffocate desire. Because desire does not want to know everything. It wants to discover. When partners become too fused, when individuality fades into function, when people stop seeing each other as separate beings with inner worlds, desire struggles to survive. Sex becomes scheduled instead of spontaneous, predictable instead of playful, expected instead of chosen, and eventually, avoided instead of desired. Routine is efficient, but efficiency is not erotic. Eroticism is born from presence, not obligation. From attention, not habit. From the feeling that the other person still surprises us. In many relationships, desire fades quietly as partners become roles rather than individuals. One becomes the provider. The other becomes the caretaker. Someone becomes the responsible one. Someone else becomes the emotional one. And while these roles may keep the household functioning, they flatten the erotic landscape. Because desire wants to encounter a person, not a role. When you stop seeing your partner as a separate individual with their own desires, fears, and mysteries, sex begins to feel redundant. Why reach for what already feels fully known? This is why many couples report that desire was strongest at the beginning of the relationship. Not because the love was deeper then, but because the mystery was alive. Early desire feeds on imagination, on what is not yet fully known, on the tension between closeness and distance. As relationships mature, that tension often disappears. Partners share everything. They witness each other's vulnerabilities, routines, frustrations, and weaknesses. While this builds intimacy, it can also erode erotic charge if there is no space left for individuality. Desire does not like total transparency. It needs room to breathe. This does not mean secrecy or emotional distance. It means allowing each person to remain a separate psychological being. When partners stop cultivating their own inner lives, passions, and identities, desire often collapses, because you cannot desire what no longer feels distinct. Another critical factor in the loss of desire is emotional safety taken too far. Safety is essential for trust, but when safety becomes complacency, desire weakens. When partners assume the other will always be there, always available, always accepting, erotic tension fades. Desire involves choice. And choice requires the possibility of distance, not abandonment, not threat, but the recognition that the other person is not guaranteed, that they are chosen, not owned. When relationships become based on entitlement rather than choice, sex often turns into obligation. And obligation is one of the fastest ways to kill desire. Many couples don't stop having sex because they don't want it. They stop because sex becomes loaded with expectation. Expectation to perform. Expectation to satisfy. Expectation to meet needs without acknowledging emotional complexity. Over time, sex stops being a place of freedom and becomes a place of pressure. One partner feels responsible for maintaining the relationship through sex. The other feels controlled by that responsibility. Neither feels safe enough to desire freely. Desire requires emotional permission. The permission to want without guilt, to refuse without punishment, to explore without judgment. When couples lose this permission, sex becomes emotionally dangerous, so they avoid it. Not because they don't care, but because avoidance feels safer than disappointment. Another reason desire collapses is unspoken resentment. Resentment is one of the strongest anti-erotic forces in a relationship. When emotional needs go unmet, when efforts feel unrecognized, when power imbalances persist, desire retreats. The body remembers what the mind tries to ignore. You cannot desire someone you feel emotionally indebted to. You cannot desire someone you resent. You cannot desire someone you feel obligated to please. Desire requires a sense of freedom. In long-term relationships, freedom often gets replaced by duty. Partners begin to say yes when they want to say no. They silence their needs to keep the peace. They sacrifice authenticity for stability. And while the relationship may survive, desire often does not. Because desire is deeply connected to truth. It cannot thrive where honesty is unsafe. This is why simply trying harder to have sex rarely works. Scheduling sex, forcing frequency, following techniques, none of these address the deeper issue. Desire is not a mechanical problem. It is an emotional one. It asks deeper questions. Do I still feel seen as a person? Do I feel desired for who I am, not for what I provide? Do I feel free to be myself in this relationship? When the answer to these questions becomes unclear, desire withdraws. Many couples misinterpret the loss of desire as a personal failure. They blame their bodies, their age, their hormones, their stress. And while all of these can influence libido, they rarely explain the full picture. Desire does not disappear randomly. It responds to emotional environments. When relationships prioritize stability over vitality, safety over curiosity, harmony over truth, desire often becomes collateral damage. This does not mean couples must choose between love and desire. It means they must learn to hold both, to create security without suffocation, to allow closeness without fusion, to nurture commitment without erasing individuality. Desire survives where partners continue to meet each other as evolving beings, not as fixed roles. not as predictable patterns, but as people who still change, still surprise, still choose each other. In the next chapter, we will explore what happens emotionally when the absence of sex turns into resentment, rejection, and a deep sense of loneliness, even inside a committed relationship. When the absence of sex turns into resentment, rejection, and emotional loneliness. The most painful part of a sexless relationship is not the lack of physical touch. It is the emotional story people begin to tell themselves because of it. When sex disappears, the mind looks for meaning, and meaning is rarely neutral. One partner starts to wonder if they are still desirable. The other starts to fear they are never enough. And slowly, intimacy transforms into interpretation. Every refusal becomes personal. Every silence becomes a message. Every distance becomes proof of something unspoken, but deeply felt. The absence of sex creates a vacuum, and vacuums never stay empty. They fill with assumptions, fears, and quiet conclusions that reshape how partners see themselves and each other. For the partner who desires more, the lack of sex often feels like rejection. Not just of the body, but of the self. They begin to ask questions they never had to ask before. Am I still attractive? Am I still wanted? Did I change? Did something break in me? Over time, this internal questioning erodes self-esteem. Desire becomes tied to worth. Sex becomes a measure of value, and the absence of sex feels like emotional invisibility. This partner may begin to feel lonely even while being loved, supported, but not chosen, cared for, but not desired. And that loneliness cuts deeply. Because humans do not only need connection, they need to feel desired by the person who knows them best. On the other side, the partner who desires less often carries a different emotional burden. They may feel pressure instead of rejection, guilt instead of longing, fear instead of freedom. They begin to associate intimacy with obligation. Sex becomes something to manage rather than experience, something to avoid rather than explore. They may feel constantly evaluated, measured by frequency, judged by responsiveness. And over time, this pressure shuts the body down, because desire cannot exist where the body does not feel safe. This creates one of the most painful emotional paradoxes in relationships. The more one partner pursues, the more the other withdraws. The more one feels rejected, the more the other feels controlled, and both feel misunderstood. What begins as a sexual disconnect becomes an emotional standoff. Neither partner feels truly seen. The one who wants more feels needy, ashamed, or powerless. The one who wants less feels invaded, inadequate, or defensive. And slowly, resentment enters the relationship. Resentment is not always loud. Often, it is quiet and corrosive. It shows up as sarcasm, as emotional distance, as irritability over small things. It appears in thoughts never spoken aloud, in comparisons never admitted, in fantasies that exist only as escape. Resentment grows when people feel trapped in emotional roles they never agreed to. One becomes the pursuer, the other becomes the gatekeeper, and neither role feels loving, because desire cannot be demanded, and intimacy cannot be negotiated like a chore. As resentment deepens, couples often stop talking about sex altogether, not because it no longer matters, but because talking about it feels too dangerous. Every conversation risks conflict. Every attempt risks rejection. Every silence feels safer than vulnerability. So sex becomes the unspoken topic that controls the emotional climate of the relationship. It is present, even when absent. And this silence does more damage than most couples realize. Because when sex disappears, many couples lose their primary space for emotional repair. Sex is often where partners reconnect after conflict, where tension softens, where forgiveness happens without words. Without that space, conflicts linger longer. Emotional wounds heal slower. Distance becomes harder to bridge. Couples may still talk, They may still solve problems, but something essential is missing. The body is no longer part of the relationship conversation, and when the body is excluded, intimacy becomes incomplete. This is where emotional loneliness takes root. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of feeling understood and desired. Many people in sexless relationships describe a profound sense of isolation. They share a bed, but not intimacy. They share a life, but not longing. They share responsibilities, but not desire. And this loneliness is particularly painful because it exists inside connection. There is someone there, but they feel unreachable. This emotional isolation often leads people to question the future of the relationship, not necessarily because they want to leave, but because they no longer feel alive within it. Some begin to fantasize about being seen again. Others shut down their own desire to avoid pain. Some emotionally detach to survive. And a few seek validation outside the relationship. Not always through physical affairs. Sometimes through emotional ones. Sometimes through work, attention, or imagined lives where desire still exists. This is not about morality. It is about unmet emotional needs. When desire is ignored for too long, it does not disappear. It relocates. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is that both partners often believe the problem is unsolvable. They tell themselves, "This is just how long-term relationships are." They normalize emotional starvation. They lower their expectations to protect themselves from disappointment. And in doing so, they slowly give up on a part of themselves. But desire is not a luxury. It is a vital emotional force. It connects people to vitality, creativity, and presence. It reminds them that they are more than roles and responsibilities. When desire disappears completely, relationships often lose their emotional color. Life becomes functional, but flat. This is why the absence of sex is rarely just about physical frequency. It is about emotional access. Who still has access to whom? Who still feels chosen? Who still feels free to want? When those questions remain unanswered, resentment grows quietly in the background. And the longer it stays unaddressed, the harder it becomes to return to each other. In the next chapter, we will explore the most common mistakes couples make when they try to fix the lack of sex, and why those attempts often make things worse instead of better. The mistakes couples make when trying to fix the absence of sex. When couples finally acknowledge that sex has disappeared from the relationship, the first instinct is often to fix it quickly. They look for solutions. They search for techniques. They ask how to bring sex back. But this urgency, while understandable, is often where things begin to go wrong. Because sex is rarely the real problem. It is the expression of deeper emotional dynamics that have been building quietly over time. And when couples try to repair the sexual connection without addressing those deeper layers, they often make the situation worse. One of the most common mistakes is turning sex into a task. Couples schedule intimacy. They set goals. They measure progress by frequency. At first, this can feel hopeful. It gives structure. It creates intention. But very quickly, sex begins to feel like an obligation. Instead of desire leading to intimacy, intimacy is forced to produce desire. And desire does not work that way. The body does not respond well to pressure. It does not open under demand. It retreats. When sex becomes something that must happen to save the relationship, it stops being a place of freedom. It becomes a performance. And performance is one of the fastest ways to shut desire down. Another mistake is focusing exclusively on physical technique. Couples read books, they watch videos, they try new methods. They assume that better technique will reignite passion. But technique without emotional safety often feels invasive rather than exciting. When the emotional connection is strained, physical advances can feel threatening. The body senses when intimacy is disconnected from genuine presence. No amount of novelty can compensate for unresolved emotional distance. Because desire is not created by what we do, It is created by how we feel while doing it. Another damaging mistake is assigning blame. One partner becomes the problem. The one who wants less is labeled cold, broken, or uninterested. The one who wants more is labeled needy, immature, or obsessed. These narratives destroy intimacy because desire cannot survive where people feel judged. Shame is deeply anti-erotic. When people feel criticized for their level of desire, their bodies close even further. They stop trusting their own responses. They disconnect from their sensations. They learn that wanting or not wanting is dangerous. And once the body learns that desire leads to conflict, it protects itself by shutting down. Another common error is using sex as a currency. Sex becomes a reward for good behavior, or a bargaining chip in emotional negotiations. I'll want you if you change. I'll desire you when you become different. This dynamic turns intimacy into control, and control kills desire. Desire requires autonomy. It needs choice. When sex becomes conditional, it loses its emotional authenticity. Another mistake is ignoring power dynamics. In many relationships, the absence of sex is connected to unequal emotional or practical burdens. One partner may feel overwhelmed, overworked, emotionally unseen. When someone feels drained or resentful, desire often disappears. Trying to restore sex without addressing these imbalances is ineffective, because desire cannot grow in a landscape of exhaustion. Another deeply damaging approach is minimizing the problem. Some couples convince themselves that sex isn't that important. They frame desire as superficial. They shame themselves for wanting more. But desire is not trivial. It is tied to identity, vitality, and emotional connection. When couples dismiss the importance of sex, they often dismiss a part of themselves. And what is dismissed does not disappear. It goes underground. There is also the mistake of over-communicating without emotional safety. Couples talk about sex endlessly, but without empathy. Conversations become interrogations. Explanations become defenses. Instead of creating understanding, communication increases tension. Talking about sex requires emotional containment. Without it, words can feel sharper than silence. Another mistake is expecting desire to return exactly as it was before. People change. Bodies change. Relationships evolve. Trying to recreate early-stage passion often leads to disappointment, because desire in long-term relationships does not look like desire at the beginning. It must be reimagined, not replicated. Couples who succeed are those who accept that intimacy evolves. They stop chasing the past. They start building something new. One of the most harmful mistakes is waiting too long. Many couples delay addressing the absence of sex for years. They hope it will resolve itself. They avoid discomfort, but the longer silence persists, the harder reconnection becomes. Distance solidifies. Patterns become rigid. Avoidance becomes the norm. At this stage, even small attempts at intimacy can feel foreign. Another damaging pattern is using humor to deflect pain. Jokes replace honesty. Sarcasm masks vulnerability. While humor can soften tension, it cannot replace truth. Avoidance dressed as humor still keeps desire at a distance. Perhaps the most tragic mistake is losing curiosity about each other. Partners stop asking meaningful questions. They stop wondering. They assume they already know everything. And when curiosity dies, desire follows. Because desire is fueled by interest. When couples stop being interested in each other's inner worlds, sex becomes disconnected from meaning. And without meaning, it loses its emotional power. Fixing the absence of sex is not about forcing intimacy back into the relationship. It is about restoring the conditions where desire feels safe to return. That requires patience, honesty, and emotional courage. In the next chapter, we will explore what true reconnection looks like. Not as a return to the past, but as a conscious, mature form of intimacy built on choice, presence, and emotional truth. Reconnection, conscious desire, and emotionally mature intimacy. Reconnection does not begin in the bedroom. It begins in the emotional climate of the relationship. Desire returns not because couples decide to have more sex, but because they rebuild the conditions that make desire feel possible again. This is where many people misunderstand intimacy. They believe desire must come first, and connection will follow. But in long-term relationships, connection often comes first, and desire follows. Reconnection requires a shift from performance to presence. It asks partners to stop asking, "How do we have sex again?" and start asking, "How do we meet each other again?" Emotionally mature intimacy is not about intensity. It is about truth. It is the ability to be honest without punishment, to express longing without pressure, to refuse without fear. Desire can only return where emotional safety exists. Not the safety of predictability, but the safety of acceptance. Where wanting more does not shame. Where wanting less does not threaten. Where difference does not create distance. One of the most powerful acts of reconnection is reclaiming individuality. Desire grows when partners see each other as separate beings again, not extensions of each other, not roles, not obligations, but individuals with inner lives, desires, boundaries, and autonomy. This means allowing space to miss each other, space to choose each other, space to be curious again. Desire is fueled by choice. When intimacy is freely chosen rather than expected, it regains emotional charge. Reconnection also requires repairing emotional wounds. Unspoken resentments must be acknowledged, not to assign blame, but to restore emotional truth. Resentment does not dissolve through silence. It dissolves through recognition. Being heard is often more erotic than being touched, because feeling understood reopens the body. Another essential element of reconnection is redefining what intimacy means. Intimacy is not only sexual, it is eye contact without distraction. It is touch without agenda. It is presence without expectation. When couples reintroduce non-demanding touch, the body begins to relax. Desire does not respond to urgency. It responds to invitation. Emotionally mature intimacy respects pacing. It understands that desire may return slowly, and that slowness is not failure. It is trust being rebuilt. Another crucial shift is moving from entitlement to appreciation. Desire weakens where intimacy is taken for granted. When partners feel appreciated, not for what they provide, but for who they are, desire regains warmth. Appreciation restores dignity, and dignity is deeply erotic. Emotionally mature couples also learn to speak about desire without turning it into demand. They share fantasies as invitations, not expectations. They express longing without pressure. They allow space for uncertainty. This creates an environment where desire can reemerge organically. Reconnection also requires accepting that desire changes over time. It becomes less spontaneous and more intentional, less impulsive and more conscious. This does not make it weaker. It makes it deeper. Conscious desire is not driven by novelty alone. It is sustained by emotional presence. It is the desire to meet the other as they are now, not as they once were. Emotionally mature intimacy embraces imperfection. It allows awkwardness. It accepts hesitation. It does not demand immediate resolution. Because desire does not thrive under deadlines. It grows in environments of patience and curiosity. Another vital component of reconnection is restoring playfulness. Playfulness creates lightness. It reduces pressure. It invites exploration. Desire often returns when intimacy feels less serious and more alive. Laughter, teasing, shared experiences. These reawaken the emotional bond that supports erotic connection. Reconnection also means accepting uncertainty. There is no guarantee that desire will return in the same way. but emotional honesty always strengthens the relationship, regardless of outcome. Choosing to face the absence of sex together is itself an act of intimacy. It says, we are willing to see each other fully, and that willingness changes everything. The absence of sex does not have to mean the end of a relationship, but ignoring it often leads there. When couples face it with courage, curiosity, and compassion, it can become a doorway to deeper connection, not because sex is restored mechanically, but because intimacy is redefined consciously. Desire survives where people feel free to want, free to refuse, free to change. Emotionally mature intimacy is not about constant passion. It is about sustained aliveness, about choosing each other again and again, not out of obligation, but out of presence. And when intimacy is rooted in emotional truth, desire no longer has to be forced. It finds its way back naturally, sometimes quietly, sometimes slowly, but honestly. This is not a promise of perfection. It is an invitation to awareness, because the absence of sex is not a verdict. It is a message. And when that message is heard, relationships can transform, not into what they were, but into something more conscious, more authentic, and more alive.